No sandstorm is blowing in from the desert. No wildfires are burning on the horizon. No sirens are warning the public to stay indoors. Yet high above the towering skyline of Dubai, something invisible has just closed. The city is still breathing out. But the sky has stopped helping it breathe. We often think of urban vulnerability in terms of economic crashes or sudden tourism crises. We measure a city by its hotel occupancy rates and retail foot traffic. But there is a different kind of pressure building above this metropolis. It is a meteorological phenomenon that fundamentally alters the environment millions of tourists and residents experience. Over the next few hours, everything this flawless city emits might be trapped exactly at the height where human beings take their next breath. Welcome to the hidden mechanism that turns a luxury destination into a sealed room. To understand what is happening in the sky, we first have to look at the ground. Dubai is a machine engineered for endless growth. Every year, millions of international visitors pass through its airports. They are drawn by the promise of pristine beaches and climate-controlled luxury. The local economy relies heavily on this constant influx of tourism and foreign capital. Hotels face immense pressure to maintain high revenue per available room. Real estate developers continue to launch massive projects to avoid the perception of a slowing market. The retail sector depends on heavy foot traffic in outdoor promenades. This creates an ecosystem that never truly sleeps. Construction sites operate around the clock to meet aggressive deadlines. A vast network of delivery drivers navigates the highways to supply the hospitality sector. Power plants burn fuel to keep the indoor spaces perfectly chilled. All of these activities share one unavoidable byproduct: they generate emissions. Under normal conditions, this is just the cost of doing business. The atmosphere absorbs the exhaust and carries it away. The tourism engine keeps running. But this entire economic model assumes that the environment will always cooperate. It assumes the sky has an infinite capacity to dilute the consequences of rapid urban expansion. That assumption is becoming much harder to maintain. There are days when the atmosphere stops cooperating. When this happens, the pristine image of the destination faces a severe test. The pressure shifts from the financial markets to the respiratory systems of the people on the streets. If you want to know why a city with record-breaking visitor numbers still faces profound hidden vulnerabilities, you have to look up. You have to understand what happens when the ceiling of the city suddenly drops. Dubai controls almost every aspect of its built environment. The city dictates the height of its skyscrapers and the temperature of its malls. But there is one crucial dimension it cannot control. It cannot control the height of the mixing layer in the atmosphere. The mixing layer is the volume of air available to disperse the pollutants generated by the city. Think of the city as a massive glass room filled with people and machines. If the ceiling of that room is high, the smoke from the machines spreads out and becomes harmless. The air remains breathable. But imagine if that ceiling begins to slowly lower itself. The machines are still running and the smoke is still pouring out. The same amount of pollution is now being squeezed into a much smaller space. The concentration spikes. This is not a failure of urban planning, but a simple reality of atmospheric physics. A city built on endless real estate expansion assumes it has infinite space. But when the atmospheric lid drops, the vertical city suddenly feels very cramped. Tourists who paid premium prices for panoramic views look out the window and see only a gray haze. The visual contrast is startling. The skyline that represents peak human engineering is swallowed by a natural phenomenon that humans cannot switch off. This creates an immediate problem for a tourism industry built entirely on aesthetics and outdoor leisure. If the beaches are veiled in smog and the outdoor cafes become uncomfortable, the core product of the city is compromised. The promise of the destination drifts away from the actual experience. This is where the meteorological event begins to trigger a quiet economic crisis. What exactly forces the sky to close over a city? The mechanism is invisible, but it operates with absolute physical certainty. Under normal conditions, the sun heats the surface of the earth. The ground warms the air immediately above it. Because warm air is lighter than cold air, it naturally rises. As it rises, it carries away the dust and exhaust generated by the urban systems below. This vertical movement is the ventilation system of the planet. It dilutes the pollution and replaces it with fresher air. But occasionally, the temperature structure of the atmosphere flips upside down. A layer of warm air moves in and sits directly on top of the cooler air near the surface. Meteorologists call this phenomenon a temperature inversion. The warm layer acts exactly like a physical lid. The cooler air below is trapped because it is too heavy to push through the warm boundary. The vertical ventilation system completely shuts down. The air becomes incredibly stable and completely stagnant. This means everything the city produces has nowhere to go. The inversion does not create the pollution. It simply prevents the pollution from leaving. For a city heavily reliant on tourism and real estate sales, this creates a hidden vulnerability. When an inversion settles over the region, the massive volume of construction dust from oversupplied real estate projects cannot escape. The exhaust from millions of vehicles supplying the retail and hotel sectors pools in the streets. The city continues to operate at maximum capacity, but the atmosphere has effectively gone on strike. There is no wind to clear the air. The city is forced to marinate in the exact byproduct of its own economic success. To grasp the true scale of the risk, we have to identify what is actually trapped inside this sealed room. It is a complex chemical mixture created by the relentless economic engine of the city. First, there is particulate matter. Fine particles known as PM10 and PM2.5 come from both the surrounding desert and the endless construction sites. Dubai is caught in a cycle of constant development to sustain its economic model. Every new luxury hotel and residential tower generates microscopic dust that enters the stagnant air. Then there are the nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide emissions. These are the direct results of an economy highly dependent on fossil fuels for power and transport. The massive logistics networks required to keep the luxury retail sector fully stocked rely on fleets of heavy trucks. The power grids work overtime to supply electricity to energy-intensive mega projects. When the temperature inversion locks these gases near the ground, they undergo further chemical changes. The intense sunlight bakes the trapped emissions and triggers photochemical reactions. This creates ground-level ozone. Ground-level ozone is highly reactive and causes immediate respiratory distress. The most dangerous pollutant is not necessarily the one with the highest concentration. It is the one that meets the human body at the exact wrong time and place. For a destination that markets itself as a safe haven, this chemical reality poses a serious threat. Geopolitical risks in the region already put pressure on the tourism sector. The city cannot afford to have its own atmosphere become an additional deterrent. The very elements that make the city rich are the same elements filling the locked room. The real impact of a temperature inversion is not measured in atmospheric data alone. It is measured by the human body. The human respiratory system becomes the ultimate sensor for the city. We have to look past the macroeconomics and focus on the individuals breathing the air. Consider the construction worker stationed outside for 8 hours a day. They are building the next wave of luxury real estate that the city desperately needs to sell. Physical labor increases their breathing rate and draws the trapped particulate matter deep into their lungs. Consider the delivery driver navigating through heavy traffic to bring a meal to a high-rise apartment. They are fully exposed to the concentrated nitrogen dioxide pooling on the asphalt. These are the people keeping the hospitality and retail sectors functioning. But the pressure extends to the tourists as well. A family paying premium rates for a holiday expects a flawless outdoor experience. If the air burns their throats or obscures the famous landmarks, their perception of the destination changes instantly. The human body does not care about economic forecasts or tourism targets. It only reacts to the air it is forced to process. This creates a severe inequality in how the city is experienced. Those who can afford to stay inside climate-controlled environments are temporarily protected. Those whose livelihoods depend on outdoor labor absorb the true cost of the trapped emissions. When a destination becomes associated with environmental discomfort, the entire business model is at risk. Negative reviews and health concerns can spread quickly and threaten future bookings. The human sensor ultimately dictates the survival of the tourism market. If you look at the official reports, you might think the problem has already been solved. The city is not standing still, and the government has invested heavily in monitoring networks. Studies conducted between 2013 and 2021 show significant improvements in primary pollutants. Sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide levels have dropped as new policies take effect. The local authorities are actively trying to green the economy and reduce the environmental footprint. This data is accurate, and it shows a system trying to correct itself. But here is where the story takes a critical turn. A long-term average is a statistical comfort that means absolutely nothing to a person taking a breath on a Tuesday afternoon. Annual improvements do not erase the severe danger of a localized hourly spike. This is the data paradox that hides the true vulnerability of the city. The official success story relies on dividing the total pollution by 365 days, but the atmosphere does not distribute pollution evenly. When a severe temperature inversion forms, the danger is intensely concentrated in a short window of time. Imagine pouring a single drop of dark ink into a large bucket of water. The water remains mostly clear. Now imagine pouring that same drop of ink into a tiny glass of water. The water turns completely black. The amount of ink never changed. The only thing that changed was the volume of water available to dilute it. Even if the city has successfully reduced its total annual emissions, the lowered ceiling still creates a toxic environment. The atmospheric lid traps the pollution from above, but the architecture of the city traps the pollution from the sides. The urban form of Dubai features massive clusters of towering skyscrapers and tightly packed developments. These structures completely alter the way wind moves across the surface. When you walk through the financial district or the high-density residential zones, you are walking through artificial glass canyons. These canyons block the natural airflow and create pockets of totally stagnant air. Even if a slight breeze manages to penetrate the temperature inversion, it is often stopped by the buildings themselves. This means the pollution generated by traffic is locked at the street level. The retail sector heavily relies on outdoor dining and pedestrian shopping districts to generate revenue. But if the street becomes a poorly ventilated chamber, the foot traffic quickly disappears. Consumers retreat indoors, leaving the outdoor commercial spaces empty and unprofitable. The structural design of the city exacerbates the meteorological trap. Architects designed these towers to maximize floor space and provide stunning visual impacts. They rarely designed them to facilitate the dispersion of toxic gases. The result is a microclimate where vehicle exhaust and cooling tower emissions recirculate constantly. The city acts as a physical barrier against its own ventilation. This is a profound risk for a real estate market already facing concerns about oversupply. If certain high-density neighborhoods become known for poor street-level air quality, their property values are directly threatened. The hospitality industry also suffers when the immediate surroundings of a luxury hotel become unpleasant to navigate. The urban layout turns a temporary weather event into a localized economic chokehold. When the outdoor air becomes hostile, the immediate response is to retreat indoors. Dubai has built some of the most spectacular indoor environments on the planet. The massive shopping malls and sprawling hotel complexes are designed to be entirely self-sufficient. They offer an illusion of total isolation from the harsh reality of the local climate. But this isolation is a highly expensive myth. Indoor air quality is fundamentally dependent on the outdoor environment. Buildings must constantly draw in fresh air to keep the occupants safe and comfortable. When the outdoor air is choked by a temperature inversion, the building HVAC systems must work incredibly hard. They must force the polluted air through extensive filtration banks. These filters quickly become clogged with particulate matter and require constant maintenance. The energy cost to run these systems spikes dramatically. For the massive hotels hosting global conventions and corporate events, this represents a hidden tax. The profit margins in the hospitality sector are already under pressure from regional competition and shifting travel trends. When a hotel is forced to spend a fortune simply to ensure its guests can breathe safely, the financial model weakens. Furthermore, no building is perfectly sealed. Every time a sliding door opens at a busy mall entrance, the stagnant air rushes in. The luxury environment is constantly fighting a losing battle against the atmospheric reality outside. This dynamic creates a divided society. Those who move directly from an air-conditioned apartment to an air-conditioned car live in one version of the city. But the financial burden of maintaining this indoor illusion ultimately trickles down to the consumer. Rising operational costs lead to higher prices, which can damage the long-term competitiveness of the destination. To truly understand the danger, you have to watch an accumulation event unfold hour by hour. The crisis does not begin with an explosion or a sudden collapse. It begins quietly, at 5 in the morning. The air is cool, and the temperature inversion firmly locks into place. By 6:30, the morning rush hour begins. Thousands of vehicles pour onto the highways, emitting a fresh layer of nitrogen dioxide. Because the ceiling is low, this gas has nowhere to go. By 8 o'clock, the massive construction sites roar to life. Heavy machinery kicks up clouds of fine dust that hit the invisible lid and bounce back down. By 10 in the morning, the intense desert sun begins to bake the trapped chemical mixture. The photochemical reaction accelerates, and ground-level ozone begins to form. By noon, the people working outside are breathing rapidly to cope with the heat and the labor. They are drawing maximum doses of the toxic mixture directly into their bloodstream. By 2 in the afternoon, the primary pollutant driving the health index might shift from dust to ozone. The environment is actively changing its chemical composition, while the economy pushes blindly forward. The danger here is not that a vital machine has broken down. The danger is that every single machine is working exactly as intended. It is the natural release valve that has failed. If the wind does not return to break the inversion, the accumulation simply continues. The tourism sector, the real estate market, and the retail industry are held hostage by the stability of the air. The economic heartbeat of the city becomes its own worst enemy. Can a city with limitless ambition actually break the invisible lid? However, the city is not entirely powerless. It must recognize the difference between what it can control and what it cannot command. The government cannot dictate the wind speed or the moment an inversion will form. It cannot stop regional dust from drifting across the borders due to geographical instability. But it can control how much it adds to the trapped environment. The solution requires a radical shift in how the city manages its growth. It requires implementing strict emissions caps that activate dynamically when the meteorological conditions deteriorate. If the sky closes, the city must voluntarily slow down its economic engine. Construction activities might need to pause during severe inversion events. Heavy logistics traffic could be restricted to prevent dangerous spikes in nitrogen dioxide. The real estate sector must prioritize urban layouts that promote natural wind corridors rather than blocking them. These are difficult choices for a system built on the promise of uninterrupted expansion. Slowing down means delaying projects and potentially reducing short-term profits. But the alternative is far more costly. If the city refuses to adapt to the physical limits of its environment, it risks a much larger crisis of its tourism appeal. A destination known for toxic air will quickly lose its competitive edge against rising regional rivals. True resilience requires sacrificing maximum output to ensure long-term habitability. If the city can learn to breathe in sync with the atmosphere, it can secure its future. Eventually, the afternoon heat shifts the balance, and the wind finally returns. The stagnant layer of air is forcibly pushed out by a new weather front. The invisible ceiling shatters. The skyline emerges from the gray haze, as if nothing had ever happened. And this is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire phenomenon. A temperature inversion does not leave a crack in the concrete. It does not shatter a glass window or lean a tower off its axis. It only changes the empty space between the buildings. Dubai has proven it can chill the desert and filter the air behind thick glass walls. But there is one vital system that all the wealth in the world cannot force open on command. The sky. As long as the city ignores the limits of the atmosphere, the pressure will continue to build. If you value documentaries that look beyond the skyline and investigate the hidden systems of our world, subscribe to the channel. The next warning sign is rarely where the official brochure tells you to look. This documentary is an independent analysis based on publicly available meteorological data, environmental studies, and economic reports at the time of production. Urban economic conditions, tourism trends, and environmental policies are subject to continuous change. This video explores systemic urban pressures and atmospheric phenomena and is not intended to attack any residents groups or specific businesses. The content provided does not constitute financial investment or personal travel advice. Certain conclusions represent analytical inferences drawn from the cited public sources.